Journalists and Writers Foundation and SecurityWomen, I would like to welcome you all to the CSW70 panel discussion, Transforming Women, Peace and Security Agenda from Resolution to Reality. Journalists and Writers Foundation is an international civil society organization affiliated with the United Nations Department of Global Communications. JWF is dedicated to culture of peace, human rights, and sustainable development. We promote diversity and inclusion by creating forums for intellectual and social engagement, generating knowledge with stakeholders, building partnerships worldwide, and developing policy recommendations for a positive social change. SecurityWomen is also an international advocacy organization for the inclusion of more women in security sector institutions, including the military and police throughout the world. The premise is that a better security for all society can be created through greater gender equality and, of course, the likelihood of a less violent and conflict-ridden world. Well, today the Security Council Resolution 1325, Women, Peace and Security, will be, of course, at the forefront of our discussion, a landmark resolution that is not solely about the protection of women in conflict zones, but also recognizes women as agents of change, architects, and in fact leaders of peace, not only beneficiaries. Yet I must admit that we face a different, a stark reality today. 2025 report of the Secretary General Antonio Guterres on Women, Peace and Security indicates that just last year, more than 676 million women and girls lived within 50 kilometers of a deadly conflict event, the highest recorded number since the 1990s. And in the midst of an escalating polarization at a global scale, our panel today will address many interconnected issues such as how to transform the commitments of Resolution 1325 into reality, where do we stand in terms of national action plans, how do we combat an absence of political will, and rebuild trust for multilateral organizations for the empowerment of women in peace and security. In our discussion today, our panel session will be moderated by Chief Celissa Lehue, who is serving as the Chief of Police for the town of Chapel Hill, North Carolina, leading the Chapel Hill Police Department, proudly known as the Guardians of the Hill. With more than 20 years of law enforcement experience, she is recognized for principled leadership, collaborative partnerships, and innovative public safety strategies. Chief Lehue champions community-oriented policing, crisis response partnerships, diversion initiatives, and women-building efforts within the profession, mentoring and recruiting women into law enforcement leadership roles. She's a frequent regional and national speaker on leadership, ethics, investigation, and modern policing transformation. In 2026, she received the Public-Private Partnership Award in recognition of her work alongside business leaders, nonprofits, and community stakeholders to strengthen downtown safety and economic vitality. She also serves at the executive board of the North Carolina Police Executives Association and the U.S. board member for SecurityWomen. Chief Lehue holds a master's degree in Justice Administration from Methodist University and is a graduate of Perf's Senior Management Institute for Police. Well, Chief Lehue, over to you.
Thank you. Good morning and welcome. It's a privilege to moderate this conversation and to be joined by such a distinguished group of leaders whose work advances the women, peace, and security agenda from global policy to local practice. Let me briefly introduce our panelists today. Pablo Castillo-Diaz serves as the policy specialist on peace and security at UN Women. For more than 15 years, he has worked to strengthen global efforts to prevent and respond to sexual and gender-based violence in conflict settings and to ensure that the deliberations and decisions of the United Nations Security Council fully address women's right and gender equality. Originally from the Canary Islands, he studied political science and international relations at Complutense University of Madrid and holds a PhD in global affairs from Rutgers University. Welcome. Maureen Mo Mago is the co-founder of the 30 by 30 initiative and a senior advisor to the Excellence in Policing and Public Safety program at the University of South Carolina. A former attorney with the United States Department of Justice, she has spent much of her career advancing evidence-based policing and leading collaborative reform efforts with law enforcement agencies across the United States. She earned her Juris Doctorate from the George Washington University Law School. Merity Johnson is the Program and Research Manager for the NGO Working Group on Women, Peace, and Security, where she leads research and policy analysis that informs recommendations to the UN Security Council. Her work focuses on advancing accountability and strengthening implementation of Women, Peace, and Security agenda. Prior to this role, she worked with the Global Justice Center, supporting women's civil society organizations, advocating for justice and accountability in conflict settings. She holds a master's degree in comparative politics from the New York University. Meg McGurk serves as the Community Safety Planner for the town of Chapel Hill, working within the Chapel Hill Police Department. Since joining the department in 2018, she has led initiatives focused on recruiting, supporting, and advancing women in policing through strategic partnerships, recruitment efforts, and workforce development. Prior to this role, she spent 12 years as Executive Director of the Chapel Hill Downtown Partnership, leading economic development for the town's Central Business District. She holds a Master of Public Administration from North Carolina State University. I am so grateful for each of our panelists for joining us today and for the leadership they bring to advancing women's participation, protection, and leadership for peace and security. Welcome. From the vantage points of daily operational leadership, I know that real change happens not in statements, but in systems. Today, we examine how the Women, Peace, and Security agenda move beyond endorsement and becomes embedded in the way institutions hire, promote, protect, and lead. 25 years after Resolution 1325, the question before us is not whether women belong in police and security. It's whether our institutions are willing to do the structural work required for implementation. Pablo, I'm going to start with you. From inside UN processes, what does the lack of political will actually look like in practice?
Thank you so much. I'll give 3 concrete examples. We have the largest humanitarian crisis in the world in Sudan, one in which the atrocities committed against women and girls are too gruesome to even read, and too revealing of the failures of our international security architecture. And yet there are many efforts, diplomatic efforts to resolve the conflict, and none of them include women meaningfully, and most of them exclude them completely. And the UN, to my knowledge, the UN is not making much noise even about this. We also have the world's most systematic repression of women's rights in Afghanistan. And yet the Taliban still get exemptions to travel, exemptions for their sanctions, to travel outside of Afghanistan. And the UN is not at the forefront of the movement to codify gender apartheid as an international crime. And finally, we have the world's largest terrorist organization in Daesh, one that at its peak, when it controlled a big chunk of Iraq and Syria, ran one of the most well-documented systems of sexual slavery and trafficking. Yet, again, none of them have been sanctioned to date by the UN sanctions committees. So those are 3 examples.
Thank you. What leverage exists within the UN system to move member states from endorsement to enforcement?
So when enough powerful countries agree, which is very rare these days, the UN can authorize the use of force, set up international justice mechanisms, and impose sanctions. Outside of that agreement, the UN system, so outside of member states, the UN agencies, the UN Secretariat, they can basically only persuade, incentivize, and shame. This is why so much of the UN's work looks like just talk, because that's much of what we have. And the UN is wholly dependent on the governments and the member states. Rich countries for money, the rest of the countries for visas to even be in those countries. So that's why, in a way, as maddeningly frustrating it can be, I consider it a privilege that I, along with Merite, get to work on influencing the decisions of the Security Council, which for all of its limitations, do send powerful signals to the world about what the highest body in charge of international peace and security care about. And at a very minimum, but it's still very important, it produces specific instructions to what the UN tools, peacekeeping missions, special political operations, sanctions committees, what they should prioritize and what they should do.
Thank you. Mirati, from your vantage point, working closely with the NGO working group and engaging with the Security Council, where do you see the biggest disconnect between commitments and real progress?
Thanks. So, should I move the microphone closer to you?
Oh, yeah. Sorry.
I don't know how it works. Thanks. So, yeah, in the last year, instead of being able to celebrate 25 years of progress on the WPS agenda and how far we've come, we actually found ourselves defending it at the Security Council against intensifying efforts from member states, primarily the United States, to eliminate fundamental concepts from the agenda, such as support for women's participation, the full scope of women's human rights, including sexual and reproductive rights, and especially the use of the word gender in any context: gender equality, gender sensitive or gender responsive approaches, gender-based violence, or gender expertise, just to name a few. As a result, in 2025, only 46% of Security Council decisions had any kind of language related to women, peace, and security, literally just using the word gender or women or sex, etc., which is a sharp drop from 62% in 2024 and the lowest percentage since 2009. Negotiations on the mandate renewals for peace operations and sanctions regimes, which are some of the tools that Pablo mentioned, have become increasingly difficult. So while we have been able to retain a lot of important language in some of these mandates, thanks to strong advocacy and coordination, both civil society and member states, we've also lost quite a bit. So for example, Resolution 2794, which renewed the Haiti sanctions regime, and which the US co-penned, changed one of the key benchmarks for modifying or lifting sanctions measures, which previously was progressive reduction in incidents of sexual and gender-based violence, and now it just says incidents of sexual violence. So this seems very small, but it now means that the Haiti Sanctions Committee will no longer consider other kinds of gender-based violations in its assessments of the situation on the ground. So this precludes recognizing and thus accountability for violations like forced labor, forcible recruitment, trafficking, and violence on the basis of sexual orientation or gender identity. We also lost language on sexual and reproductive health in the renewal of MINISFA in Abyei, where operational language on facilitating access to sexual and reproductive health services was taken out. Similarly, the renewal of MINUSCO in the DRC removed language urging the DRC government to facilitate SRH services to victims and survivors of sexual violence. These kinds of changes fail to meet the standards established by the 10 WPS resolutions. They set a really alarming precedent for Security Council products moving forward, and they will directly affect women and girls on the ground, ultimately, in places like Haiti, DRC, South Sudan, etc.
I'm so sorry, as you're recording the event for virtual participation, can you please use the mic?
Oh, yeah.
I thought it was fun.
Is it?
Yeah, maybe even.
Do you mean
Just hold it up.
Yeah,
holding it?
up.
Hold it? Okay. Sorry.
Mirati, what needs to change at the Security Council level to move from strong language to stronger implementation?
Thanks. Is this good? Can you hear me?
You can closer.
Even closer? Okay.
Yeah.
If you need me to be louder, that's not a problem. So from what we've seen in 2026 so far, these attempts to erase WPS from council products are only going to continue and probably intensify. So holding the line and defending these existing standards is going to be really critical. So for example, in January's negotiations on renewing the UN Support Office in Haiti, where the US again is a co-pen holder, the zero draft that was presented reportedly had no mention, not just of gender, but even of women in general. The only mentions that made it into the final adopted text relate to references to sexual violence against women, men, and children, which is itself a watering down of previous language on sexual and gender-based violence. The text also took out previous references to gender, women's participation in electoral and political processes, or women protection advisors. Similarly, in the renewal of the peacekeeping mandate in Cyprus, we saw the word gender removed or replaced, and language on women's political participation, again, was watered down. So 8 council members currently are signatories to this initiative called the WPS Shared Commitments, which, among other commitments, I think there's 14 now, include ensuring that Security Council products integrate strong language on WPS, as well as upholding provisions of all previous resolutions pertaining to WPS and advocating for their full implementation. And while they've made these commitments on paper, it's going to be absolutely critical for them to actually demonstrate the political will to fight for WPS during negotiations. And I think sometimes it's easier said than done. And UN leadership also has an important role to play here in supporting and publicly defending the agenda, including in the briefings that they provide to the Security Council. So we published a report earlier this month analyzing country-specific briefings by senior officials at the Security Council. And we found that last year, despite established UN guidance, senior officials largely do not prioritize WPS in their briefings to the Council. So for example, last year, only 22% of country-specific briefings out of 185 included any kind of gender-sensitive analysis, examining unique impacts of conflicts on women and girls. 26% mentioned women's participation in any capacity, and just 7% expressed actual support for women's rights and gender equality. So,
Thank you. For Pablo and Verity, and you touched on this, is the current UN structure strong enough to enforce WPS, or does it require reforming?
So, so this is me talking. It's not UN Women's position or anything. This is just my personal opinion on the matter. I worked at the UN for long enough to have to know that I don't think structural reform solves the problem. At least not in the way that structural reform is understood at the UN, which is all about, mergers and tinkering with these posts and adding these posts and cutting these posts and rebranding these things and moving this box to this other box. I don't think that the specific shape of the bureaucracy does anything to solve this problem. I think it has more to do with political, bigger political questions, and the fact that many of women, peace, and security norms, or some of them at least, are not, first of all, are not illegal and are not a priority for either the government or the voters of many of the democratic countries that support this agenda. So I think that that's also part of the equation, and it shows in how governments actually prioritize and fund what they fund and not fund what they fund. But through the years, different attempts at restructuring have either failed or respond more to personal or political interests rather than sort of a best design technical assessment. And I've seen this in the context of growth. I think that in years past, in the context of growth, I've seen WPS grow in a way that wasn't always the best, and that led to duplication and internal competition, and that fed the WPS industry in global capitals, more so than in the countries affected by these issues, in a way that I think has generated at best mixed results. And then in the politics of contraction, which are the politics of the moment, I think we're likely to cut both flesh and bone as much as we cut fat. So I'm generally skeptical. I think that one could dream of a completely different UN, one which spent much more on the 30 to 40 countries that really need it, and much less in the global capitals, but they are the ones that are actually paying for all of it. And also maybe a different UN, one in which our development, humanitarian, and peace and security support was conditional on certain human rights and gender equality principles. But that again risks the UN being even more sidelined or replaced by completely different external actors. Still, I think that structural reform, in the way that we talked about it, the tinkering with the bureaucratic shape, won't fix it. And one of the worst suggestions I've heard is the appointment of a special envoy on women, peace, and security. I think that we have plenty of high-level UN officials in headquarters with a mandate to working on these issues, and having another one will actually make things worse, in my opinion.
Echoing pretty much everything Pablo has said, on the WPS. I have to hold it close. Oh, okay. Yeah. On the point quickly of the special envoy on WPS, I think there's also a risk of these issues then becoming siloed under just this one special envoy position, rather than actually being implemented or sort of mainstreamed into all the other mandates that currently exist. So I think that's something that also is a real danger. Just in general, just to add, I think the WPS agenda and international law in general they're not self-enforcing. It's up to member states to actually demonstrate the political will to uphold these standards and defend them without double standards, across all situations. In the context of the Security Council, it's the primary body tasked with maintaining international peace and security, but as all of us in this room probably know, it's increasingly unable to actually carry out that mandate, whether it's in Ukraine, Gaza, Sudan, at the expense of its own credibility, really. Negotiating space is also shrinking across the board, not just on WPS. The Council's making progressively fewer decisions. Last year, it made adopted 44 resolutions, which is the lowest since the end of the Cold War. We're just seeing shrinking space, increasing polarization across the board. Just to also follow up on Pablo's point about the sort of proposed restructuring, one of the proposals as part of the Unity Forum initiative is this proposed merger of UNFPA and UN Women, which, again, is not getting at the core issue of the liquidity crisis, which is member states not paying their dues. It's not, loaded or sort of mandate overlap. UN Women and UNFPA overlap in only about 20 to 30% of their work. So they do have really distinct mandates, and the idea of potentially merging them could actually lose a lot of expertise on SRH and gender equality at a time when we need that more than ever. So I think it is not a great idea, and the decision ultimately rests with member states on whether to carry that out.
Thank you so much. Mo, apparently you have to eat the microphones. What distinguishes reform that survives leadership turnover from reform that fades one's attention shifts?
I love that question.
Yes, amazing question.
At first, I just want to say, I feel like we've heard a lot of realistic and appropriate focus on how bad things are in many ways, right? But I will tell you, being in this room with these people is doing a whole lot of good for my soul. I mean, we've certainly had our own share of challenges in doing this as a whole.
Thank you. Meg, first question, and I know it took us 4 to 5 years to accomplish this, so I'm anxious to hear your response. We often frame progress in terms of hiring numbers, but implementation is not simply about increasing representation, as Mo told us. It requires a cultural shift. How do we change the institutional mindset so that women's competencies are not viewed as an additive, but as an essential indicator of stronger, more effective organization overall?
Good morning, everyone. To give a little context here, my position at the Town of Chapel Hill Police Department is recruitment and hiring, and that's my chief at the end of the table that I work for. So,
He has to get this right.
So when we talk about the cultural shift or changing the narrative or reframing the mindset, we have to, it's not just about hiring, it's not just that women are in addition to the men in the organization, it is looking at what women bring as core competencies, and saying that that is what is integral to your organization's effectiveness, and really reframing everything that you do around that. So that's not about representation, it's about a mission-driven kind of efficiency and effectiveness for the organization. And that's when it's really a lot of what Mo's touched on already. Those competencies that women bring, the de-escalation skills, the critical thinking skills, the collaborative partnerships that kind of women inherently bring with the community, those should all be embedded within every level of recruitment and hiring. And then even furthermore in the organization, it has to go into policy, it has to go into training, career progression, everything that you're doing. It's important that leaders then talk about it like that, so that it isn't about bringing women, it isn't leaders saying we're bringing women into the organization, it's women saying we are focused on collaborative partnerships, we are focused on these core capabilities that are inherent to that kind of mission-driven effectiveness. And then it really is that those are no longer considered soft skills that women have, right? They are part of what the organization does to be successful. And that's kind of when the narrative happens, when those capabilities are represented in every single level of the organization. Leaders are speaking about it as organizational effectiveness.
What structural barriers preventing women from entering policing are fully within an agency's control and therefore no longer defensible?
Yep. So it's really, these really are department choices. It's not about women's capability or women's interest in policing. It starts with recruitment and the messaging and visibility. I mean, it almost feels like a no-brainer at this point, right? That women should be visibly represented in our photographs, in our messaging, in the words that are used. But it's very incredibly important that they still are. Candidates, women, girls, need to see themselves in these spaces. They need to see themselves in that uniform with the full gear. And the candidates really do pay attention to who holds leadership positions. Being in the space that I am with recruitment and hiring, and we ask these questions, through the entire process. What is it about our department that interests you? What is it? Why are you, motivated to pursue policing? And since we joined the 30 by 30 initiative a few years ago, since Chief Leahy has been our, very visible leader, it is not uncommon anymore for both men and women to reference that we are part of the 30 by 30 initiative and to say something about, I saw Chief Leahy on the news, or I saw her on social media. They see themselves in this space as a police officer because they're seeing our department representing that. It's also really important, it continues with beyond just the hiring, but within the entire process, that some departments they take way too long. One of the big reforms that we had within our organization when Chief came in and I started getting into recruitment and hiring is reducing the hiring process. Some organizations take 4 to 6 months. We do it under 2, and we've even done it as quickly as 1. When Chief has told me to get it done, we get it done. And then we over-communicate. When I started in recruitment and hiring a few years ago, it was a generic email. It said hiring at, right? And there was no name attached to who was the person you were going to talk to or who was going to take you through the process. There was no next steps. There was nothing ever communicated that said, this is what is going to happen to you in the next couple of months if you want to become a police officer in our department. And that was one of the first things we changed. My name and direct phone line and email are all over everything that we do as part of that hiring and recruitment process. I answer every phone call. I talk to every single person that walks into our department who even just casually says, I'm thinking of becoming a police officer, or I have questions. And so that there is a person that is being communicative and transparent. I never let a single candidate leave without saying, these are the next steps if you apply, or, and let them know. And it's really important that that communication is out there. Candidates will view your department as being transparent and fair, and they'll recognize that level of communication is inherent in the department. That if they were to join, that's the kind of communication that happens as they continue in their career. Another important aspect of these structural barriers the departments completely have within their control is the background process, the background investigation of candidates. So often, there is some very inherent traditional, out-of-dated concepts that come to background investigations. Women often have non-traditional paths in careers, or they may have gaps in their careers, and we really have to change that mindset that there isn't one kind of candidate who brings certain education or certain hiring or certain jobs in their background, that women have these very non-traditional things and those bring value. We also have to be very careful to think about if you have external vendors that your organization is working with and hiring, they too are bringing some of those old school inherent biases. And we're talking about when we have external vendors that are going for psychological evaluations or polygraph exams or something like that. You have to make sure that anyone that is working with your candidates has the same values and priorities and philosophies as you do as an organization, because they are assessing them, and you need to know what tools and resources they're using to assess them, and that they are in line with what your organization is wanting in a candidate. And all of those are completely within the control of your department. In fact, it doesn't take any money, it doesn't take any policy changes to implement any of that.
If an agency is serious about sustainable progress, what metrics should it track immediately to ensure that cultural change? Not just about hiring, but it's actually occurring.
Yeah. So the hiring, when you track hiring, that's literally who's just entered your department. It means nothing for sustainability or what's really happening culturally within your department. What you really need to look at is you have to track career milestones at 3, 5, 10 years. We found that it's a different generation, it's a different mindset of whether or not someone enters the police force, whether it's going to be their career or if this is a job. And at those 3, 5, and 10 years, we see people leaving the department because, and it can be for a variety of reasons, right? It could be family, it could be a career change, they could be going to another department, but you need to track when it's happening and why it's happening. You also need to track at those milestones for women who's being promoted, who isn't being promoted, who's putting in for rotational positions or specialty assignments. Are women putting in for those even? Are they even discussing in the department and with their peers whether they're interested in those? And that'll help you see if you are creating your own cultural barriers for women within your department. If it's systemic, it's something you need to address. Or if they're putting in for them. And just like Mo said, whether or not they get them, if you have those same, evaluation and performative measures that are equal, then you know where that shift is happening. Agencies really need to pay attention to why your people are leaving. We always talk about exit interviews, and have structured exit interviews, understand where they're going, but sometimes it's the informal conversations as well. You need to know, and it's fine if they're leaving for, like I said, family reasons or something else, but you need to find out if it's because of something your own organization has created that has made it difficult for women to stay within the organization. And all of those, again, are within the control of the department.
Okay, for any of our panelists, how do global commitments translate into daily operational decisions inside our institutions?
So I mentioned earlier that Security Council decisions do affect very strongly what the UN on the ground actually does. And so the mandates of peacekeeping missions, sanctions committees, special political missions, when they have very detailed instructions on women, peace, and security, that gets reflected in the strategic plan and concept of operations of that mission, and most importantly, in the staffing tables of that mission. And one of the ways in which you can learn what these big UN missions do on the ground, more so than the reports they submit to the Security Council or the communications pieces they put on the website, you can read their budget reports. And there you see a more detailed explanation as to what they spend their money on, and you get a better sense of the entry points for advancing women's rights and gender equality through these tools.
Yeah, I guess building on that, as I mentioned before, these changes to mandate language that seem really minor on paper can actually have significant impacts on women and girls living in these conflict and crisis settings. So, for example, removing gender advisors or women's protection advisors undermines these functions of peace operations. Gender advisors are responsible for integrating the WPS agenda or mainstreaming it throughout the work of the mission, and removing them from the actual mandate language means that they're not going to be there are not going to be resources allocated to hire people for those positions, especially now in the context of the liquidity crisis where missions are having their budgets cut up to like 15%. If there's not a specific mandate on paper for this person to get a job, it's going to be so much harder for those resources to actually be allocated for them. Are we good?
Thank you. Okay, for all of you, what is one change at your level that could realistically be implemented within the next 12 months?
I think at my level, in an organization, it's really about evaluating your hiring practices and making sure, like I said, you're incorporating those core competencies that women bring to law enforcement in particular, that they are embedded within your hiring practices, setting those really clear timelines and being completely transparent in communication, putting a name and a face to everything that a candidate will see, will experience, throughout the process, so that they see that that is part of the kind of natural transparency of the organization.
I'll say one thing that we're focusing on over the course of the next year at the 30 by 30 initiative is around improving systems and structures that prevent and address sexual harassment in our public safety organizations. We have some really concerning data in the United States that over 90% of women in these organizations experience sexual harassment. We did a survey of women in our participating agencies, and 100% of the women who responded said they had no faith in their organization or little faith in their organization to be able to respond appropriately if they were to be sexually harassed. I think we are unfortunately at a point in our country where we can't really point to any one particular agency or part of the country that's handling that well and seriously enough. And one of the things that we know is that the psychological safety toll that takes if you're experiencing harassment in the workplace or from your partner even, it can be pretty significant, and it makes us lose really qualified, really wonderful people. So I will say trying to create those standards is something that's a highest priority for us over the next year.
I think in terms of the Security Council, what's realistic depends entirely on member states' willingness to actually use all these tools that they have at their disposal. The council can and should preserve all these existing WPS provisions, and it can also add stronger language with more gender components to these mandates, or strengthening the existing language. And member states can also find ways to hold the line. And sorry. and hold the line and make clear that the erosion of the standards is absolutely a red line for them. It's unacceptable. But obviously, this is.
Yeah, one of my jobs or my tasks, like her, is influencing the decisions of the Security Council. And in the council, it's 15 council members. A slight majority has signed on these commitments to prioritize women, peace, and security. I would say even more than that, at least rhetorically support women, peace, and security. But when it comes to negotiations, it's much more divided. And the gravitational pull on my time of those that support the agenda and will be sort of on our side in the negotiations is very strong, in part because obviously they're supportive of our work, or because some of them are funders, and also because in some ways it may be easier. But I think at this moment it is even more important that I spend much more of my time on the others that don't necessarily support this agenda during negotiations, and that is a hard thing to do, but it is possible at my level.
Thank you so much. As we conclude and open it up for your questions, I'd like to just ask each of you to reflect briefly, what is one action you will prioritize, whether policy, partnership, or leadership decision that could most accelerate the implementation of women, peace, and the security agenda?
Sorry, maybe this is very similar to the other question, but one of the things I do is influencing the decisions of the Security Council. Other things I do, I manage this global program on women, peace, and security, and I also I write the Secretary General's annual report on women, peace, and security. So a good friend of mine said that this year it is very important that in all the spaces that we occupy, all the papers that we write, that we give as much visibility as we can to the politics of resistance in this moment. And so that's what I plan to do.
For our part, as the NGO working group, we're an independent civil society coalition. We're going to continue to push for all council members, to defend and preserve WPS standards in all its decisions. For example, one upcoming challenge will be the renewal of UNMISS, the mission in South Sudan, which expires at the end of April. In the 2025 renewal, council members were able to come together like a cross-regional group and retain most of the gender language in that mandate, including gender advisors, women's participation, sexual and gender-based violence, and with South Sudan currently at risk of returning to full-scale civil war, it's more important than ever that the Security Council work to ensure that women and girls are central to the UN's response on the ground. The NGO working group, we're also going to continue our work of supporting independent women's civil society to brief the security that it holds them accountable in a way as well. Just to mention another sort of component of our research is we're seeing a concerning decrease actually in the number of women civil society who are being invited to brief the Security Council. So last year, the council only heard 31 briefings from women civil society, which is a 44% decrease from 2024 and the lowest number since the COVID pandemic in 2020. This is likely due to a number of factors, not just the travel restrictions to the US, but also security concerns for women from different contexts. It's very dangerous to them to potentially speak out so publicly, and also the sort of political dynamics at the council. For example, last year we also only had one Sudanese woman brief the Security Council at all, compared to I think 6 briefings the year before. So that's also going to be something, it's obviously dependent on member states to make that happen, but we'll be continuing our work to support women's civil society in that capacity.
Thank you. I think one thing that we're definitely going to be focusing on is activating men in prioritizing the importance of the issue. When we speak about these types of issues, the rooms often look like this. And women did not create the systems that we are currently trying to take down. And I think we need to be much more strategic at our level, because the men who don't believe that gender equity is important are not going to listen to women about why gender equity is important. So we need to create more space and support our allies. We found that there are a lot of men in positions of power who agree with us, but they're not necessarily sure exactly what to say. They don't want to say the wrong thing. They don't want to make things worse. And it's, I think, up to initiatives like ours to make sure that they have what they need to step into their transformative potential as allies.
And one thing I think of at the level that our organization and I'm at in the organization is to encourage others to join things like the 30 by 30 initiative. Other law enforcement agencies, many of them around us are already joined, but the smaller ones haven't. So I think that's a big priority, and then to really talk about why that's important, to make sure that those kind of measurable goals for hiring, recruitment, retention are visible. They aren't just embedded in all of our agency's values and priorities, but they're very visible, and that we're talking about it, that others see that, and be a good representative of that.
Thank you. I'm going to choose to walk away today very encouraged, especially with all of us in the room today. You know, the Women, Peace, and Security agenda affirms something that we already knew, that women are not merely affected by conflict, they shape the conditions of peace. What remains is not proof of capacity, but alignment of courage. Courage to reform institutions, courage to measure progress honestly, and courage to move from language to leadership. Global commitments set the direction, national frameworks build architecture, local leadership brings implementation to life. The framework does exist, the evidence exists, and leadership exists. What remains is the discipline to align our systems with our commitments, not in theory, but in practice. Progress is possible, accountability is measurable, and the time to move from resolution to reality is now. Thank you so much for being here today. I'm going to open it up to all of you for any questions you might have for our panelists.
I'm a Nigerian and I'm of the Nigerian delegation. We know the issue of insecurity and issues around women experienced in crisis and conflict is common in my country. And I am happy to, this is my first time of attending the side event that is focused on issues of women in security. I have two, I don't know what I would call it, questions, but probably explanation on how to deal with the issues raised here from these excellent panelists this morning. The first one, I think I would like to direct that to Pablo. You have given us a lot of insight into how the UN operates in addressing issues that regards women in crisis, from the Security Council decisions and to how the UN tries to carry out those decisions. And what interested me most was, which I knew was there, and you mentioned it, that they are divided when it comes to the decision, even though they all have a unified opinion that women should be protected. So I just want to ask Pablo, what are the options before the United Nations when the government in power in those countries where these things are happening are powerless to help the women? And the UN decisions are also violated by both sides. What are the options before the UN? What are the alternatives that they can bring to bear to address the suffering, the pains of women in crisis, particularly the young women in their reproductive years, and the young girls who are supposed to be in school? Then the second one goes to all of you, particularly those who are the NGOs. How do you deal with when the people that are put to protect the women are the ones that are violating the women? They're the ones that are raping them, they're the ones that are marrying them when they're still children, they are the ones that are stopping the supplies that are supposed to go to the women. How do you deal with those military, police, whatever they put together to protect the women? Thank you.
Great question. I said a little bit of this in one of my first comments, but the traditional way in which the UN supports is through a Security Council decision deploying some kind of presence in those countries. Typically a large peacekeeping mission when there's money for that, and political space, sometimes mediation, special envoys, those sort of things. And then the UN can also try to punish the perpetrators through setting up international courts or sanctions and those sorts of things. But these normally affect a very small number of perpetrators, and there are often very limited options for enforcement of these decisions, even when there are international justice mechanisms and sanctions and all of that. But I should say that the UN also tries to help in other ways. The UN has its, a huge presence in terms of humanitarian aid and also development cooperation. And when they work on development cooperation, they try to support the government in that place and nudge them sort of in the right direction. What we're having now is, in the current moment, with so many military coups, so many wars, so many governments that are not seen as legitimate partners of the United Nations, or that are violating the UN Charter, etc., is a space where the options for the UN are actually smaller and smaller. And this is why the finding ways of supporting women's civil society organizations and women's movements in those countries becomes even more important, because working with the government is not really an option. So that is why in the latter years we are learning more and getting more requests for supporting women human rights defenders at immediate risk for taking a stand, helping relocate them, or giving them the tools to protect themselves, or connecting them to actors that can protect them, as well as channeling funding to women's organizations in these countries directly, which is an incredibly difficult thing to do the way that foreign aid is set up. And in many cases, many of these organizations won't be able to be registered with the current government because of the illegitimate nature of that government, or the political changes. So these are things that the UN is working on, and some of the options that we have.
Just to add very quickly that one of the sort of complicating factors is that to have a peacekeeping mission or a special political mission in a country, it has to be there with the consent of the host government, and when a host government doesn't want that mission there anymore, that's kind of the end of it. If thinking about when UNITAMS was asked to leave Sudan at the end of 2023, I believe. So yeah, that's sort of a complicating factor there. Also, just to sort of piggyback on the point about women human rights defenders, in addition to the sort of existing funding structure being really difficult for them to obtain funding, they've also been the hardest hit by humanitarian aid cuts. Because they are so small, a lot of Human Women did a study last fall that the majority of the organizations they surveyed said that they would have to shut down within the next 6 months if the situation didn't change.
I'll address the second question about how to possibly respond when people who have been given the power of the state abuse it and use it to hurt women. And it's horrifying to hear and think about. I mean, it's not widespread, but we certainly have instances of that in the US, and there's actually just a high-profile case in one of our major metropolitan departments where someone had been doing that for years, and there were dozens of victims that were encountered. I think for so many people that's so unconscionable, they don't even think that that's a possibility. So shedding light on it, holding people accountable whenever we can, but that requires some government structures that might not be in place. The other thing to think about is, and it's not a satisfying or immediate solution, but going back to those hiring standards, who are you getting for the job? Who is screening that? How are you defining good? And then the last part of it is, we are called the 30 by 30 initiative because we hope that by making the changes that we propose, we will see 30% of women in police recruit classes. And the reason why we go for 30% is there's research that shows that when you get 30% of women in a place, they're able to change the culture, right? So if you have an organization that wields the power of the state that's been acting with impunity and perpetrating violence against women, increasing women, ensuring that that place actually has safeguards in place for the people who are doing that job, right? Because if they're treating the public poorly, they're probably treating their coworkers poorly too. But changing what good looks like there might change who gets to do that job. And the more we can focus on getting women in the door, I would believe, at least I hope, perhaps naively so, that you'll see a decrease in these types of violence against women as well.
To go through all the emerging threats, all the new, like the last resolution was in 2019. Do we need more resolutions? Do we need new resolution, new language to cover emerging threats, emerging challenges? This is my first question. For my second point, it's more like, I'm just wondering, when Pablo were presenting and we just raised the issue of the appointment of special envoy on peace and security at the United Nations, and this would solve the issue or make it worse. I don't know if you are speaking about operationalizing the agenda, like we need to move from the commitments to the on-ground work. Wouldn't, for example, hiring special envoy or gender advisor or technical person like has a special mandate on peace and security, has a specific mandate, I would say that this would make the situation, won't solve the solution, won't give the solution or won't solve the issue, but I'm just thinking, would that make the situation any better? Because she was just asking about the peace operations. For example, we know the cases of sexual exploitation and abuse in peace operations, but whenever the UN, for example, hired gender advisors or advisor or gender technical people that works on the mission on gender advisor, we know that, for example, the cases of reporting increased. For example, it increased the trust in the mission itself, or it decreased the number of the cases of SEA during the mission itself. So this just made me wonder, if we are hiring the special envoy on peace and security, would this practically making it worse or help solve the situation itself? So I was just wondering, it's just a thought I want to share with you, a reflection. Thank you very much.
I'll answer the last one first. A special envoy on WPS would be another high-level UN official in headquarters. That would get a team, that would do visits to countries, that would speak in New York. We already have a de facto and de jure leader in the UN system on women, peace and security, which is the head of UN Women, which inherited the mandate when it would brief the Security Council. The head of UN Women briefed the Security Council 20 times in the past 4 years, which is more than any other UN agency. It's more than UNICEF, it's more than the High Commissioner of Human Rights, it's more than any other UN agency outside of the UN Secretariat. So she's briefing the Council plenty. But most importantly, the head of the Department of Political Affairs and the head of the Department of Peacekeeping Operations are also very involved in implementing women, peace and security, and feel this way. So when there's big meetings, they want to be there. If we're talking about women, peace and security, they want to be there. The Secretary General is very involved. The Deputy Secretary General is also very involved. If we create a special envoy on women, peace and security, that all goes away, and then we just silo it in this one person. And again, what we need is expertise and money on the ground, not in New York. Whether it is gender experts in the UN, or it's actually more funding for civil society organizations on the ground, or even more support for governments that want to do something positive. Not more Undersecretary Generals in the UN, which we have way too many of. If UNAID should be about something, it should be about reducing that number, in my opinion. And then secondly, on whether the WPS agenda itself is fit for purpose, I believe it is. I believe there's no issue with the agenda in itself or in its conception. It's just that we haven't implemented it. I think we've done plenty of good things, and it's important to recognize that. The programs servicing millions of women in conflict-affected countries, whether through tailor-made humanitarian aid for female-headed households or reproductive health or domestic violence survivors or sexual violence survivors, many of these programs didn't exist in the 80s or in the early 90s. They are sort of a new thing. The hundreds of laws in conflict-affected countries that have been adopted that are favorable to women's rights, the targets for women in security systems or in justice systems. These didn't exist before, and so those are all positive things, and those are things that women's organizations got done, and they should be celebrated for it. But we fell short in the two most important respects. We did not change the face of power and politics, and especially in conflict-affected countries precisely, and in the superpowers, in the powerful countries that determine much of what happens to all of us. We have not changed the face of politics and power there, and we have not changed the upward trajectory of military spending, which dwarfs by hundreds of times what we spend on the UN or civil society organizations or any of this. So I think that it's not a problem of the agenda itself. It's that, the powerful people have not wanted to implement it.
Yeah, agreed. The agenda itself is absolutely fit for purpose, and I think from the experiences of our partners around the world, partners from Myanmar who are advocating for establishment of a federal inclusive democracy, they are using the agenda in their advocacy, not just at the UN, but in regional fora, in their own national decision-making processes. The agenda itself is not the problem, it's the implementation.
We have another question here.
Well, I agree with most of that has been said. First, thank you for such a wonderful and amazing discussion. It's related to civil society and women-led organizations. As we all have said, that the word of the day, we're all suffering from severe cuts that is affecting the humanitarian sector and affecting also the existence of women-led organizations, especially in the South. However, as we were all in agreement that to take the resolution to reality, that we need to work on the ground and we need to empower these civil rights organizations and CBOs on the ground. However, in my region, the MENA region, I've always seen that the United Nations are always working with the government, with the national mechanisms, and not the civil society. And 1325 by itself is a sensitive resolution that is often misunderstood as a threat to the security or the national security of the government, although it is not. And it needs a lot of support, especially from the UN system and the UN country offices in the ground. The space for civil society is shrinking and the funds are shrinking, and I think we need a different approach or strategy to address that. Over.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to realize that it's not an accident that these funding cuts are affecting women, human rights defenders, and independent civil society on the ground the most. That was a foreseeable consequence and one that the people making those cuts were very aware of. So I think it's important that we name that as well. It's a feature, not a bug, basically.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Shira Powers. Thank you so much for being here. I'm so appreciative. This is going to be a more centralized question, mostly for within the domestic-ish center of America. How can root-grass movements work better with the police department to create success and will eventually lead to policy change?
question. And I mean, 30 by 30, I didn't get into our origin story, but we are a grassroots movement, right? It was a coalition of people who believed strongly in the critical importance of women to advance public safety, who came together and made sure that we all had a unified voice. I think one of the things that is a critical opportunity in the United States is in the US, right? Policing was specifically constructed to represent the public and the people, right? Where on the Pelian principles, policing is the public are the police, we have democratic accountability, and it is incumbent on police departments to actually work collaboratively with the communities that they serve. I think the political tenor in the US has been fraught for many, many years, and we've lost the ability to have these sort of proactive, pro-social discussions between community and police. It's been largely very antagonistic. People have been focused on making change through lawsuits or making change through legislation, and that plays an important role in advancing society. But there's also the opportunity to make change the collaborative way. I mean, that's certainly what we do. It's certainly how Chief approaches the work from what we can see in Chapel Hill for sure. So I think one of the things that sort of community-based organizations can do is highlight the importance of representation in our public safety systems to people like your elected officials, so that when they appoint a chief, they choose someone who understands the critical importance of this work and will be held accountable for doing it. And then I think also engaging proactively in discussions with your department in a way that is not antagonistic, but is resolution-focused, is solution-focused. Because a lot of our community-based organizations are playing a critical role in improving recruitment practices, for example, and providing these credible messengers about what the department could and should do to advance civil rights in a jurisdiction. So the good news is, I think there is tons of opportunity for collaborative reform that's just waiting for people to pick it up and run. And so I'm actually excited about the next few years.
You know, I think to piggyback on that, we talk about in Chapel Hill that we police the way the community wants to be policed. Our organization doesn't come to police, and our officers aren't trained, aren't educated in a standard way of policing. It is reflective of how our community expectations and values and priorities are for policing. And that comes with very strong leadership who sets that priority for an organization. And everything is about partnerships with people in the community. You cannot police without having their trust and having their communication and having their respect. And it is not intrinsic, certainly, in all police organizations. And Chapel Hill is in the middle of the state of North Carolina, and we sometimes say we're in a bubble because we are in many ways. And it makes it difficult sometimes to recruit. There are people that don't want to police the way that we police, but they're not the ones that we want. Everything that we do is reflective of the community, and sometimes that's difficult for certain candidates or for certain people to police, but that is who we are, and we're very proud of it, we're very open about it, and we believe we're a model for other organizations to build those kind of community partnerships, because it's everything of what we do.
Yeah, I would just add that in the simplest form, policing is the business of relationships.
Thank you. I'm with Our Secure Future, and we have worked with UN Women co-hosting NAP academies regionally in the Caribbean and in South America. And I've also left some of our briefings and papers on the back table to look at. But my question is, how do you think AI will impact the work that each of you do? And before you answer that question, one of the things we're working on is developing an AI app where you can enter a question and it can respond with the WPS lens.
Great question. Who wants to tackle that? Mo?
I can yell.
Can we take one more so that you can?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, my question is calling for women inclusion in security sector. I want to make a suggestion, if possible, because the security women actually, especially we, because I'm of the Ministry of Defense and I'm a military personnel, so listening to the discussion, it delights my mind, to talk about this. In our place, the women are not really carried along, especially the security women. So if the UN, if it's possible, can create a chapter for the security women to be included, because like we are here now, we came under the umbrella of women affairs and not the security personnel. So like we really do not have enough place to talk about women in security. Like my colleagues here, this is a military personnel, this is a military personnel, I'm a military personnel. But everything we are discussing here now is really something that concerns us the more, but we really could not make much contribution. So if it's possible, they can maybe create a chapter or maybe a platform for the security personnel itself. It will give them a good platform for them to be able to do more. I think that's my contribution. Thank you.
Thank you. Love it. We'll be in touch.
Thank you. I was wondering if AI was going to come up. It's hard to have a conversation about the future without talking about AI. And so I'm a Luddite and I'm terrified of it, but we are proactively working with tech companies regardless, because if there is a dystopian future, I'd like to play a small role in maybe making it a little bit better. So one thing that we all have to remember, right, is AI is only as good as the data it is trained on. And around the world, the existing data is biased against women and underrepresented groups, right? So AI systems in their current form, without intentional design, will perpetuate the disparities everyone in this room is fighting against. That being said, with intentional design, AI is posed to remedy the disparities that everyone in this room is fighting against. So one of the things that we're doing at 30 by 30 is we're trying to create procurement guidance for agencies. If you are going to buy a piece of AI-enabled technology, here are the 6 questions you ask that tech company about how they embedded systems in their guidance engine to mitigate the disparities that currently exist in your data. Like, we can talk with our dollars. We can challenge leaders to not buy AI-enabled systems if they have not taken specific steps and can show the homework of how they're mitigating any existing biases. The other thing we're doing is we're working with a tech company that works on professional development for law enforcement and people in the security sector. And that data is trained on male norm data, right? A lot of the research on leadership is male dominated sample sizes, because that's who is in positions of power. We are working with them to build what we are calling a wisdom layer that takes the lived experiences of women, highlights the unique value of women, and highlights the unique needs of women, as well as the specific legal protections that exist for women in a police department, and make sure all of those types of issues are embedded into the guidance that that tool provides, so that we are mitigating some of those disparities, and again, trying to use them to create equity and equality. But, you know, look, I'm not a tech person, but we can hold tech people accountable with our dollars and with the messages of what we expect for them to do. And I think as long as we're speaking with one voice about that, it's very reasonable, right? And you can see, you're already seeing in terms of the big tech companies that are emerging, who seems to be really focused on ethics and who seems to be really focused on dollars. And we can just make sure that if we have decision-making authority, we hire the people who are focused on ethics.
Fantastic.
And can I just say something too about the wonderful point about having a specific space for women in security? I mean, that is something that we promote hugely in the US. We've got, Nolly, I'll see you there, hopefully.
Yes, you will.
But one of the other things that does, in addition to creating the psychological safety and the camaraderie and sort of the information sharing, is it allows people to come together to unify around an agenda in a way that you couldn't do otherwise, so that when you are advocating for specific solutions, you're reflecting the shared voices of a lot of women in the process. So if there's anything we can do to help stand that up, we'd be happy to do that.
Love that. Make sure we're on that mailing list for those 6 questions. We've got a few more minutes.
My question is for Maureen McGowan. I've had a connection with the law enforcement agency in New York City. And I was wondering if your 30/30 initiative has had any, connection of dealing, do you talk, do you communicate with the NYPD in New York City. It's needed.
Great question. Thank you. So one of our first agencies to partner with us was the New York City Police Department. It was under Commissioner Shea. He actually went on the road for us a little bit, talking about the importance of this work. And there is a deputy commissioner for equity and inclusion at the NYPD. That was a role that was first held by Tracy Cassie, who later went on to found CPE. And we actually hired the next deputy commissioner for equity and inclusion to be our director of 30 by 30, Dr. Tanya Meisenholder. So we do have a strong connectivity at NYPD. The thing about NYPD and a lot of these major metro departments is it is a very big ship to turn. We see some of the quickest improvements in the places you would not expect it, right? A 10-person agency in the middle of Nebraska, which is not where you'd expect to find a lot of gender equity progress. In a large agency like that, we've got decades of work. That being said, I think we also have created the space to have the relationships with the people who will be there for decades. It's hard when you work at the top. We didn't realize, I think, how quickly chiefs turn over when we first started our model, but average is 2 years. Because of how we're building this though, and because of all of the different levers that have to be pulled at the agency level, I do think we have strong relationships with people who are gonna be there till they retire, and hopefully we can keep doing the work. But I don't know if it'll make you feel better or worse, but I think every major metro department that we work with in this country, which is most of them, has a lot of challenges, and understandably so, just because of the size and the scale. But yeah, if you want to talk offline about your experience, I'd be happy to chat.
I want to thank our panel once again. Thank you for being here, and thank you to all of you for being in this space today. Samri?
Well, thank you so much, foremost, for your engaging participation, active role that you took today, and many thanks to all the experts here. Well, having the last chance to address one more question, maybe to Pablo. Maureen mentioned this. In such spaces, it's really hard to find a male expert. As the Journalists and Writers Foundation, we are creating these civil society spaces on the sidelines of CSW for the last 12 years. And I must say that it is a challenge personally for me to get a male expert on board. So thank you so much for your leadership in this space. Well, both you and Merit noted about the UN initiative, UN80 initiative. Well, there's a proposed merger of UN Women with UNFPA, the Population Fund, and I think we absolutely needed a reform for this multilateral organization to better address the swiftly increasing human rights crisis. But as a human rights advocate working on women's rights, civil society spaces, I'm particularly concerned about this action. Because in patriarchal societies, in undemocratic regimes, we see ministries of women washed away. And when entities are eliminated that has a particular focus area on women and gender, we see the rate of stagnation in gender issues in women's rights even further escalate. So I would like to ask if, as you are working in UN spaces, if there are any particular ongoing dialogues or platforms that us civil society members can advocate for the existence of UN women, particularly for the ones if you don't have any consultative status at ECOSOC or DGC, it's quite hard for us to get a safe zone at UN. So anything maybe NGO group on women, peace and security, or UN entities leading a safe space for civil society actors to be a part of this process.
Thanks. We, as the NGO working group, are not, we're following, but it's not like a central tenet of our work. Ultimately, all the decisions around UN80 and whether these mergers happen or don't or whatever, that rests with member states. They're the ones who vote on the budget. The buck stops with them. I also, Post Feminista just published a report specifically about the proposed UNFPA UN Women merger, and I would encourage you to check that out because they have concrete data and recommendations for advocacy with member states as well.
Yeah, what she said, lobby member states. There are channels, UN Women has channels. You can reach out to the civil society division within UN Women to inquire about those channels.
But the buck stops with the member states. So if you want to influence, that's where you want to go.
Thank you all again for being here.